With offices in Radford and Blacksburg, Patrick K. Moore is a client-focused, community-involved law firm committed to you. If a legal issue touches your family, finances, or future, we can help. Whether it's real estate, business law, or estate planning, Patrick Moore welcomes the opportunity to speak with you about your legal issues.
Welcome, I'm Rose Martin, and we are right around the corner in Richmond with Jean Huets. Now, Jean's book is Walt Whitman himself, and he's often called the poet of democracy and America's bard. I have to tell you, his work lives all over the world, and celebrating the 200th anniversary of his birth, Jean has written a beautifully, visually attractive book, and we're going to talk all about it, about this famous man and a famous American writer. Welcome to Right Around the Corner.
Thank you.
It's exciting to have you, and I'm excited to learn about the book, and we'll talk about it in just a second. But when I was reading that you grew up in Germany, and you call half of the East Coast your home state. How did we end up right here in your beautiful home in Richmond?
Well, I went to school at Virginia Commonwealth University, and after I graduated, I moved up to New York for a while, New York City, and that's where I learned about publishing. I had a job in publishing, and then I married a Richmond boy and came back, and here we are.
Well, thank you so much for having us here in your home to talk about your work and to talk about this amazing writer. And outside of Walt Whitman, I was reading that you also have a fascination with some books dealing with tarot, and we'll talk about those a little later too, and the art that goes along with that. How did you come up with tarot and Walt Whitman in terms of interest levels to write about?
Quite by different paths. With tarot, my first job when I moved up to New York was at an occult publisher. It was then called Samuel Weiser. I think now it's Red Wheel. And they published books on tarot. And from there, I worked with U.S. Game Systems, who's probably the largest publisher of tarot cards in the world. And I worked with Stuart R. Kaplan, who's one of the world experts on tarot. And I'm not so much into the fortune telling, which is what people usually think of with tarot, but more into the artwork and the history and the symbolism of the cards.
Mm-hmm. Oh, how fascinating. And you talked about starting out in publishing and working for a publisher, and now you are a co-founder of your own publishing company.
Yes, I'm co-founder of Circling Rivers, and we publish poetry and literary nonfiction.
It's similar to Walt Whitman, right? He started out in publishing, but he worked for, 15 different papers and got fired for doing things, right?
He was a real job skipper, and he also was very opinionated. And one controversial issue before the Civil War was free soil. And free soil meant basically non-slave states. And Walt Whitman did not support new states entering the Union as slave states, and some of the papers he worked for were more ambivalent about that. And I think he just, aside from that, he just seemed like kind of a free-thinking guy and wasn't very good at settling down and doing what the boss said.
Right, so he decided that actually he self-published initially too, right? And I heard that he was actually a really tough reviewer. So if he decided to review a piece and he didn't like it, there were no holds barred, right?
Yeah, he had his opinions, definitely. He was a bit on the outside as far as the literary world went. His education, he only had about 5 years or so of formal education, but he was actually very educated in that he read tons. He went to every cultural occasion he could find, from art museums or art exhibitions to opera. And so I think some of his being an outsider had an effect on the way he saw literature by his contemporaries.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I read he actually left school at 11, right? Mm-hmm. And then he had a brief teaching career at the age of around 17. And that's not a big time span to leave school at 11, do some publishing at 15, and then be teaching for a short time at 17.
Yeah, he left publishing partly because there was a huge fire in New York, and it hit the publishing sector, like literally destroyed it. So he went back to Long Island. He hated teaching. He hated it with a passion. he wrote pretty scathing letters about it to his friends. And then when he moved back to New York, he got into publishing again. He started out as a printer, as what you would call a compositor, which is literally setting the type, taking the little pieces of type and putting it in the composing stick. And then it was sort of a natural move to being an editor, which was a path that a lot of editors took. They'd start as a printer and then move to editing. So that was his career in publishing.
So true or false, his younger siblings were named after presidents, 3 of them, right? Okay. True or false, Ralph Waldo Emerson was a fan?
Yes.
Okay. And that he didn't believe that Shakespeare even wrote his own plays?
Yeah, he did get into that.
And he was real tough on Shakespeare, right? And another one was that right before his death in 1889, a local cemetery owner propositioned him to write a poem about the cemetery in trade that he could use the poem to do publishing for his cemetery and promoting for it, and in turn, he was going to give him a free burial plot. He
did not get a free burial plot in Camden. He paid for his burial plot, and in fact, his friends gave him the money for I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was for a practical reason. They did not intend him to buy the tomb that he has at Camden, and some of them were a little dusted up over it, but that's what he did. As far as Shakespeare goes, I want to say Walt Whitman loved the works of Shakespeare. He could recite them by heart. And he did so throughout his life. There's one point in his memoir where he talks about running naked up and down Coney Island Beach, if you can picture that today, with no one but the seagulls around to hear him reciting Shakespeare and Homer. And he did the same when he lived in Washington, D.C. during and after the Civil War. He would go for walks with his friend Pete Doyle, and Pete remembered him reciting Shakespeare by heart. As they walked in the moonlight around Washington, D.C.
What were some of your early literary influences?
I always think of Charlotte's Web as my favorite childhood book. I'm not sure if that's a proper literary influence, but...
Well, what were you, 7, 8, 6?
Yeah, I was in
it's
grammar school. Yeah, definitely. I just read a lot, and I still do. I read literary stuff, and I read schlocky romances. I'm a very eclectic reader. As far as literary influences, it would be Walt Whitman in my, later on in life. There's so many. I just can't really pin any down.
And what was it like growing up? Did you grow up in a literary family? Was that love of reading and writing something that was instilled early with you?
Yeah, definitely. My parents and my older siblings, I was the youngest of 4 children, so there was always somebody to read to me, even before I learned to read. And I remember one of my early memories actually is really craving the ability to read and looking at books and looking at the letters and wishing that they would unveil themselves to me. So I just always loved reading. We always had books around the house. I don't think, I wouldn't call my parents highly literary. They were more readers of popular books and so forth. But we had the children's classics, Little Women, Tom Sawyer. They always made sure we had good books around.
Well, and that's so important. We know what an impact that has, right?
Yes,
for kids to be able to have someone read to them or to have books available, and that's so important.
Yeah. And they took us to libraries too. I just want to put a plug in for libraries because, not everyone can just go and buy a book, whenever it strikes them. And they took us to libraries. They would just leave us for the afternoon, and we would spend the afternoon just browsing, reading any old thing we wanted to.
Getting lost in stories.
Getting lost in stories, for everything from science fiction to Beverly Cleary or whatever was there.
Well, and families have such a big influence on our formative years. And even as we get older, I still will call my mom, right? And want to have that family influence. With Walt, what was that relationship like with his family? I know his mom was Quaker, right? And so there was a Quaker influence with him there. And then some of the siblings, it was quite a big family. So what was that dynamic like?
He called his mother illiterate, But what he meant was she wasn't really educated. She could read though. She definitely could read. She read his work. She read newspapers. Not a lot is known of his father in terms of what his education was. He was a carpenter by trade. He was a farmer for a while. Then he'd go and do carpentry. He sort of bounced back and forth, but mainly he was a carpenter. His siblings, his sister Hannah was the most educated in the formal sense. And I guess I would also put his brother Jeffy in there too, his younger brother, who was actually an engineer. He became an engineer in St. Louis. But he didn't find his family supportive.
How come?
I don't know. Because when I read their letters, they seem, at least Jeffy and his mother and Hannah were definitely supportive. George, his brother, George Washington, as you pointed out, named after a president, he thought that Walt Whitman kind of wasted his talent by writing poetry. It just wasn't practical enough. His brother ended up being a plumber, and he just didn't really find it a good way to spend your time.
You know, I was fascinated with the impact that he had on his family if something went wrong. Didn't he go back and have to commit one of his siblings to the hospital because they became ill and they relied on him, right?
Yes.
So they relied on him even if he wasn't physically present to take care of things.
Yeah, he was definitely, his father died in 1855, I believe it was, and even before that, he had already kind of become the head of the family, the male head of the family, aside from his mother. And there were some really dysfunctional situations in his family. And his older brother, he was the second oldest, and his older brother, Jesse, was committed to what they called the lunatic asylum for apparently he was violent, and different family members had different theories about why. And he had another brother who was a very severe alcoholic, and he died, and he caused a lot of disruption in the family. So, yeah, when something went wrong, the letters went to Walt wherever he was, help. And he would go up and try to help out and straighten things out.
Well, and that seems like that was part of his personality, that he could be crass when he was reviewing a book or he was judgmental and opinionated, but there was a tender side that he really tried to like meld the inner and outer part of himself. He didn't want people to be cruel. He wanted to show kindness. So how do you think his work balanced that personality that he had and then the message he wanted to share with the world?
His work, I would say his spiritual autobiography is Leaves of Grass. He worked on it from, at least his early 30s to the end of his life. He did several editions, always revising. And you could say he made Leaves of Grass, but also Leaves of Grass made him, because in it he expressed his ideals. And he didn't always live up to his ideals, and people will point out, especially in his editorial pieces, that he could be racist or sexist. But his ideals were really clear in Leaves of Grass, and he did do his best to become the person that he projects in Leaves of Grass.
Well, and reading about him, it was just fascinating to hear some of the things he did. And talking about Leaves of Grass, there were originally, 12 or 14 poems? 12 or 14 in the original edition, and then it grew to 300, right?
Yeah, it
and
grew
so
for
the iterations
quite
that
a
he
bit
changed.
over the years.
And so the references to father and mother, those really seem to change throughout the editions, right?
Yeah, there's a poem in Leaves of Grass that's now called "I Sing the Body Electric." That wasn't the original title of it. In fact, they didn't have titles originally, but and he mentions the mother and the father, and then it sort of slowly fades away. And I don't know why he did that.
Was that partly because he was so affected by his mother's death?
He was definitely very, very affected by his mother's death. He said it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. He was very attached to his mother. He considered that he got his best qualities from her. And there is controversy over what his relationship was like with his father. Some people say it was terrible, and that his father was abusive, and some people say, including his brother George, said, Walt and our dad got along fine.
Well, and he doesn't have any direct descendants, right? Right.
That's correct.
From him.
Any that are known. He claimed to have 6 children, but to be honest, I doubt it.
Well, and his sexual orientation has come into play over the years also, right?
Yes.
And it's something that you touch about on the book. What he was thinking about, how he was acting for the time period, and that had to be something that was intriguing for people who are reading his work, or for at the time period judging because of where society was during that time.
Yes, yeah. He presented himself not as gay. But by our eyes, he did present, looking at him today, it's like, oh, come on. He presented himself as being gay, but he always sort of pulled back from coming right out and saying it. And of course, we can understand why. It wouldn't do him much good, to admit that at that time. I think he wanted to be for everyone. And maybe not only was he being a bit self-protective, but maybe he didn't want to be pinned down as one thing or another.
I can see that.
I think he was very great, spacious in the way he wanted to present himself.
Well, and a couple examples of that were in your book, where you talked about how he went to the hospital during the Civil War to visit with the injured or the affirmed as a way to just be out of the spotlight, which he was so great at self-promoting. But when it came to that tender time of taking care of someone else, that was really important to him.
Yes, yes. He considered the Civil War. He called the Civil War the hub of his book, meaning Leaves of Grass. And later in life, he said, I couldn't have written Leaves of Grass without the Civil War, And later, one of his friends was like, oh, well, he was confused about the time period because we know that the first edition was in 1855. But really, he wasn't confused. He knew exactly what he meant, and that was, you have to see it more as a wheel than a straight linear line, and with the Civil War at the hub of his book. And of course, he did add a lot more after the war. He sort of thought his literary endeavor was over for a while because the war was so stupendous that he didn't really think he had anything to say that could, rise to the imports of the war. But he wrote a couple of little volumes of poems, chapbooks, I guess you could call them, drum taps and sequel to drum taps that were obviously about the war. And then he folded them into Leaves of Grass, and then he started writing again and added more and more.
So your book that celebrates the 200th anniversary of the year of his birth is beautiful.
Oh, thank
and
you.
The fact that you've done it almost like a magazine layout with quotes and photos and paintings. How did that process come together?
The hardest part of it was doing the research for the images, because what I wanted to do was to try to really get only images that Walt himself would have seen, like embedding ourselves with Walt Whitman. So I didn't want to use anything anachronistic, although I did sometimes interpretively. There are some paintings, for example, that are after Walt Whitman's time, but they show pretty much the way Long Island was when he was a kid. Now, there aren't any buildings or technology in the pictures. There's one of Montauk Lighthouse that actually the lighthouse had changed since Walt was in Long Island. But on the whole, I wanted it just so we could feel like we're in his life and walking in his shoes, or at least walking with him.
And that comes across because it's not a biography. It's not a story that will take you in that direction as a historical story. But exactly like you say, it's like we're walking with him, meeting the people that he met, dealing with some of the struggles that he dealt with. The everyday life, from family events to places he visited to stories that he wanted to share. So it really takes us a peek inside him and his world, and also the things that were important to him. Like, I had no idea that he had such a high esteem for the women's rights movement, or the time that he felt like we need to all have a safe voice. We all need to have a fair voice in the world. So there was this righteous component to him also.
Yeah.
And he lived a very simple life, didn't he?
He led a very simple life. It's kind of amazing how I was at his birthplace this last weekend, which is in Huntington, Long Island, and anyone who's into Whitman should go and see it. It's a wonderful place. It's an oasis in a very, highly developed area. And 10 people lived in this pretty small house. But people just kind of endured a lot of things that Americans would, many Americans would find uncomfortable. When he lived in D.C., he lived in a garret with just a rented room in a garret, and he would move around, I guess, for, who knows why. And just imagine living in a garret in D.C. This time of year,
but even having very few possessions, right? So he would just take a hunk of meat with his knife, and his sugar bowl was a brown paper bag, and it was just very simple. But yet, you also have pictures in the book and references to the fact that he was kind of messy too, with stacks of papers and books and things everywhere. Like that creative mind was everywhere. So a simple life. What do you think his message was for the world?
His message for the world, I think what draws people overall to Walt Whitman is he said, you deserve as much respect as I do, and as the president does, and as the highest person and the lowest person deserve equal respect. And that, I think, is what is so important for us to know, that I'm no better than you are, you're no better than I am. And then we can really be with each other.
That's a beautiful message. Would you be willing to share some of your work with us?
Yeah, of course. I'll read.
And you can kind of set it up and tell us what you're going to be sharing.
Yeah, since this, the title of the book being with Walt Whitman himself in the 19th century in America, Walt said, I'll read something from his essay, A Backwards Glance Over Traveled Road, and then I'll go to the other part. Leaves of Grass, indeed, I cannot too often reiterate, has mainly been the outcropping of my own emotional and other personal nature, an attempt from first to last to put a person, a human being, myself in the latter half of the 19th century in America, freely, fully, and truly on record. So that's what he said about, what I mentioned earlier as a spiritual autobiography. So I'll read the section of the book called One Nation, and it starts again with a quote. And this quote is from the introduction to the 1855 Leaves of Grass, which was the first edition. The Americans of all nations in any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. So that's the end of the quote. If Leaves of Grass has another hero beside Walt himself, it is the United States of America. Walt's prose and poetry are framed by the United States, filled in by the United States, animated by its land, its features and resources, its politics, and its people. While he looks to future readers, his present is the earthy, robust, sometimes grotesque life of 19th century America, with its violent convulsions of war and expansion, exuberant national egoism, boisterous innovations, tumult and pain and joy. Walt's life began in the Jacksonian era, stretched through the Civil War and Reconstruction, and ended in the Gilded Age. Not yet 100 years as a country, Walt's America is still, creating itself, making and remaking its legends, its history, its story. Walt reveled in its pioneer rawness, its brass innovation unfettered by feudalism, its creative spark unshadowed by cultural convention. Nothing overseas, he believed, could possibly measure up to anything American. Like the peoples who left the old world to find new opportunity in America, Walt demanded, new opportunity for poetry in America. He deliberately discarded old forms, illusions, and tropes, and consciously shed the overburden of the past. 19th century America was pulling away from her own past too. Slave-supported agriculture and manufacturing, artisan labor, a seemingly unlimited frontier, and she was moving toward her future. Ethnic diversity, abolition, wage labor and manufacturing, and American settlers, governments, schools, and churches occupying the land from coast to coast. The process nearly tore the nation apart forever.
I can see why he's called the poet of democracy, right?
Yeah, yeah. He
Absolutely.
was very much into what America had to offer.
And
the
so
potential.
insightful, right, about that potential and about each person realizing their full potential.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
inspiring the next generation and the next generation to try to reach that.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful message to share. And thank you so much for putting this beautiful book together that people can walk with Walt in a way that we haven't been able to do before. I feel like I know him so much better.
Oh, good. Thanks.
So
That's
thank you
perfect.
again for inviting us here to your home. And I'd like to especially thank Jean Huets for inviting us here to her home in Richmond and sharing her beautiful book about Walt Whitman himself. Please check us out online, learn more about our conversation with Jean about Walt Whitman and some of the other work that she's been doing. Tell all of your friends about us. I'm Rose Martin, and I'll see you next time right around the corner.